Marcus Sullivan had always believed that survival meant keeping moving. At 28, he was a paramedic from Phoenix who thought he understood the desert that surrounded his city. He had responded to countless calls in the Sonoran wilderness, pulled hikers from ravines, and treated heat-stroke victims under the merciless Arizona sun. But, understanding the desert from the air-conditioned cab of an ambulance was vastly different from being lost in it with nothing but the clothes on his back. The helicopter crash had happened so suddenly, that Marcus barely remembered the sequence of events. One moment they were flying a routine medical transport from Tucson to Phoenix, the next he was crawling away from twisted metal and flames, his uniform torn and his left shoulder screaming with pain. The pilot hadn't made it. Neither had the patient they were transporting. Marcus was alone in a landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by saguaro cacti and jagged rock formations that looked like ancient sentinels guarding secrets he couldn't comprehend. The first day had been about immediate survival. Marcus had managed to salvage a partially melted water bottle from the wreckage and a small first aid kit that had somehow survived the impact. His radio was dead, the GPS unit destroyed, and his cell phone showed no signal bars. The crash site was nowhere near any major flight path, hidden in a valley between two mesa formations that seemed to swallow sound and hope equally. As the sun began its descent on the second day, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, Marcus realized he was going to die out here. The water was nearly gone, his lips were already cracking, and the desert cold at night was sapping what little strength he had left. He had tried to signal for help with a mirror from the first aid kit, but the valley walls blocked most of the sky, and no aircraft had passed overhead. It was then that he saw the smoke. A thin column of gray rose from somewhere beyond the northern ridge, barely visible against the darkening sky. Marcus felt his heart rate spike with a mixture of hope and desperation. Smoke meant people, and people meant rescue. Without hesitation, he began climbing toward the ridge, using his remaining energy in what he knew might be his last gamble. The climb was brutal. The rocky terrain cut through his uniform pants and scraped his hands raw. His injured shoulder sent waves of pain through his body with every movement, and more than once he had to stop to keep from passing out. But the smoke continued to rise, now clearly visible as a campfire rather than a wildfire, and that kept him moving forward. As he crested the ridge, Marcus saw the camp below. It was unlike anything he had expected. 3 traditional wickiups made of bent branches and brush stood in a small clearing beside a natural spring. A woman sat beside the fire, and, even from a distance, Marcus could see that she was Native American. Her long black hair was braided with what looked like colored beads, and she wore traditional clothing that seemed to blend with the desert landscape around her. Marcus called out, his voice barely more than a croak. "Help! Please!" The woman looked up at him without surprise, as if she had been expecting him. She stood gracefully and gestured for him to come down to the camp. As Marcus stumbled down the slope, he noticed other details that seemed almost impossible. The woman appeared to be completely alone, yet she showed no fear at the approach of a stranger. The campsite looked permanent rather than temporary, as if she had been living here for months or even years. When Marcus finally reached the fire, the woman handed him a gourd filled with water without saying a word. He drank greedily, and only when his immediate thirst was satisfied did he look at her more closely. She was perhaps in her 30s, with intelligent dark eyes and intricate tattoos covering her arms and face. The markings were unlike anything Marcus had seen before, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and flow in the firelight. "Thank you," Marcus gasped. "I need to get to a phone, a radio, anything. There was a helicopter crash. I'm the only survivor." The woman studied him for a long moment before speaking. When she did, her English was clear but carried an accent that Marcus couldn't place. "You are far from the world of phones and radios here. This place exists between spaces, where the old ways still hold power." Marcus felt confusion mixing with his relief. I don't understand. Where are we exactly? How far is it to the nearest town? Distance here is not measured in miles, the woman replied, adding another branch to the fire. My name is Ayana. I am of the Chiricahua Apache, though that name carries little meaning in this place. You may call me Ayana. I'm Marcus. Marcus Sullivan. I'm a paramedic from Phoenix. He looked around the camp again, noting details that made less sense the longer he observed them. The wiki-ups looked ancient, but the materials were fresh. The fire burned without smoke except for the column he had seen from the ridge. Most unsettling of all, the stars overhead seemed brighter and, arranged differently than he remembered. Ayana nodded as if his confusion was natural. You have crossed a threshold, Marcus Sullivan. The crash brought you to a place where your people rarely venture. You are not the first to arrive here broken and desperate, but most do not survive the crossing. Crossing? Marcus felt his training as a paramedic kicking in, the part of his mind that catalogued symptoms and looked for logical explanations. Look, I think I might have a head injury from the crash. I'm probably hallucinating or confused. Can you just point me toward the nearest road? Ayana smiled, and Marcus noticed that her teeth were perfect and white, which seemed inconsistent with someone living a primitive lifestyle in the desert. Your mind seeks rational explanations, and that is good. It will help you survive what comes next. But, first, you must rest and heal. Your shoulder is dislocated, and you have lost more water than you realize. Before Marcus could protest, Ayana moved behind him and, with surprising strength, manipulated his injured shoulder back into position. The pain was excruciating for a moment, then, suddenly, diminished to a dull ache. Marcus rotated his arm experimentally, amazed at the improvement. How did you know how to do that? He asked. My people have always been healers as well as warriors, Ayana replied. Lie down by the fire. Sleep will give your body time to restore itself. Despite his confusion and the strangeness of the situation, Marcus found himself becoming drowsy. The warmth of the fire, the relief of having his shoulder reset, and the exhaustion of the past 2 days combined to make his eyelids heavy. As he settled onto a blanket that Ayana provided, he studied the tattoos on her arms more closely. The markings were intricate beyond belief, covering her skin from wrist to shoulder in patterns that seemed to tell a story. There were symbols that might have been animals, geometric designs that created optical illusions when he tried to focus on them, and flowing lines that connected everything into a unified whole. In the firelight, the tattoos almost seemed to move, shifting and changing like living things. Your markings, Marcus said drowsily. They're incredible. What do they mean? Ayana looked down at her arms, running her fingers along some of the lines. They are a map, a history, and a promise all at once. Each mark represents a choice, a lesson, or a bond that cannot be broken. They tell the story of my people and my purpose in this place. Are you some kind of park ranger or forest service officer? Marcus asked, though even as he said it, he knew it didn't fit what he was seeing. I am a guardian, Ayana said simply. I protect the boundary between worlds and guide those who find themselves lost between them. Some I can help return to their world. Others must choose a different path. Marcus wanted to ask what that meant, but sleep was pulling him under. As his consciousness faded, he was dimly aware of Ayana singing in a language he didn't recognize, her voice blending with the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of night birds he couldn't identify. In his dreams, Marcus found himself back at the crash site, but now it was different. The helicopter was whole and undamaged, suspended in midair like a museum display. The pilot and patient stood beside it, both watching him with sad but understanding expressions. They didn't speak, but somehow Marcus knew they were trying to tell him something important. The scene shifted, and he was walking through a vast library where the books were written on the walls themselves. The text seemed to be in the same script as Ayana's tattoos, flowing and changing as he tried to read it. He had the sense that these weren't just words but living things, stories that existed independent of any reader. Then, he was standing on a high cliff, looking down at two paths. One led back toward familiar territory, toward the world of ambulances and hospitals and routine emergency calls. The other path disappeared into a landscape unlike anything on Earth, where the sky held two moons and the trees grew in spiral patterns that defied physics. A voice spoke behind him, and he turned to see Ayanna standing there, but now her tattoos covered her entire body, creating a second skin of intricate designs. "Every choice creates a new marking," she said. "Every choice changes who you become." Marcus woke to the sound of water bubbling over rocks. The sun was higher than he expected, suggesting he had slept deeply into the morning. Ayanna was kneeling beside the spring, filling gourds with fresh water. When she saw he was awake, she brought him food that seemed to materialize from nowhere, dried meat, nuts, and fruits that tasted unlike anything he had ever eaten but satisfied his hunger completely. "I feel better," Marcus said, surprised to realize it was true. Not only was his shoulder pain gone, but he felt more energetic than he had in months, even before the crash. "But I still need to get back to civilization. People will be looking for me. I have responsibilities." Ayanna nodded. "Yes, they will look for you in the place where the helicopter fell. But they will not find you there, because you are no longer there." "What do you mean?" Marcus felt the confusion returning. "I'm right here. This is still the same desert where I crashed." "Is it?" Ayanna gestured around them. "Look more carefully at where you are." Marcus did look, and this time he noticed things that his exhausted and injured mind had missed the night before. The saguaro cacti were the wrong shape, their arms twisted in impossible spirals. The mountains in the distance seemed to shift position when he wasn't looking directly at them. Most disturbing of all, the sun appeared to be moving too slowly across the sky, as if time itself operated differently in this place. "This is impossible," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Impossible is a word your people use for things they do not yet understand," Ayanna replied. "You have crossed into a space that exists parallel to your world. Some might call it a spirit realm, others might say it is a pocket dimension. The name matters less than the reality." Marcus stood up and walked to the edge of the camp, looking out at the landscape beyond. Everything looked simultaneously familiar and alien, like a photograph that had been subtly altered in ways that were hard to identify but impossible to ignore. "How do I get back?" he asked. "That depends," Ayanna said, joining him at the edge of the camp. "Some people who arrive here are meant to return. Others are meant to stay. A few are meant to become something new entirely. I cannot tell you which category you belong to until you have learned more about yourself and this place." "I don't want to become something new," Marcus said firmly. "I want to go home. I have a job, a life, people who depend on me." Ayanna smiled sadly. "Everyone who arrives here says that at first. But, tell me, Marcus Sullivan, what were you really running from when that helicopter carried you into the sky?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Marcus turned away from her, not wanting to acknowledge the truth that her words had uncovered. He had been running, though he had never admitted it to himself. Running from the weight of constantly seeing people at the worst moments of their lives, from the growing numbness that had been creeping into his work, from the realization that he was saving other people's lives while letting his own slip away day by day. "That's not relevant," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Everything is relevant here," Ayanna replied. "This place has a way of bringing people exactly when they need to be brought, though rarely when they want to be brought. The crash was not an accident, Marcus Sullivan. It was an invitation." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest. An invitation? 2 people died in that crash. Good people. How dare you suggest that was somehow meant to happen? "Death is not the end that your people believe it to be," Ayanna said quietly. "But, you are not ready to understand that yet. For now, focus on simpler questions. Why do you think you survived when they did not? Marcus had been avoiding that question since the moment he crawled away from the wreckage. Survivor's guilt was common in his profession, but this felt different. He had been sitting in the back of the helicopter, the position that should have been most dangerous in a crash. Both the pilot and the patient had been more experienced, more prepared, perhaps more deserving of survival than he was. I don't know, he admitted. That is the beginning of wisdom, Ayanna said. Stay here for a time. Learn about this place and about yourself. When you are ready, the path forward will become clear. And, if I refuse? If I just start walking in what I think is the right direction? Ayanna's expression became serious. Then, you will wander in the desert until you die, and, your body will never be found because it will not exist in the world your people can search. This place protects itself from those who would exploit or destroy it. The only safe passage is with understanding and acceptance. Marcus realized he was trapped, but he also realized that his captor was offering him something that might be more valuable than immediate rescue. Ayanna clearly possessed knowledge and abilities that defied his understanding of reality. If he could learn from her, if he could understand how she had reset his shoulder so effectively and how she survived alone in this impossible place, perhaps he could take that knowledge back with him when he eventually returned home. How long? He asked. Time moves differently here, Ayanna replied. A day in this place might be a month in yours, or a month here might be an hour there. Do not concern yourself with duration. Concern yourself with purpose. Marcus looked at the tattoos covering Ayanna's arms again, noting how they seemed to shift and change in the changing light. Your markings, he said. You said they represent choices and bonds. Will I get markings too? Everyone who stays here long enough receives markings, Ayanna said. They are not decorations. They are a record of your journey and a source of power for the challenges ahead. But, first, you must prove that you are worthy of them. How do I do that? Ayanna smiled, and, for the first time since he had met her, Marcus saw something playful in her expression. You begin by learning to listen. The desert has been trying to teach you since the moment you arrived, but you have been too busy thinking to hear what it is saying. She gestured toward the landscape around them. Spend the day exploring, but do not go beyond the boundaries marked by the red stones. Learn to see this place as it truly is, not as you expect it to be. Tonight, we will begin your real education. Marcus wanted to ask about the red stones, about the boundaries, about what his real education might involve. But, something in Ayanna's manner suggested that questions would be less useful than direct experience. He nodded and began walking toward what appeared to be a game trail leading away from the camp. As he walked, Marcus tried to apply his medical training to his situation. He catalogued his physical condition, which seemed remarkably good considering what he had been through. He noted environmental factors like temperature, humidity, and terrain. He looked for signs of other human presence or any indication of how far they might be from roads or settlements. But, the more he tried to approach the situation analytically, the more the landscape seemed to resist his efforts. Distances that appeared short took much longer to cover than they should have. Landmarks that seemed fixed would be in different positions when he looked back at them. Most frustrating of all, his internal compass seemed to be malfunctioning, as directions that felt certain proved to be completely wrong. Eventually, Marcus stopped trying to navigate or analyze and simply allowed himself to wander. Almost immediately, the landscape became more cooperative. He found himself following what was clearly an ancient trail, marked not by signs or blazes but by subtle arrangements of stones and the way certain plants grew in seemingly deliberate patterns. The trail led him to a series of natural pools carved into the rock by centuries of water flow. The water was crystal clear and, surprisingly deep, fed by underground springs that created a constant gentle current. As Marcus knelt to drink from one of the pools, he noticed something that made him freeze in shock. His reflection in the water showed the beginning of markings on his own skin. They were faint, barely visible, but unmistakably there, thin lines that traced across his forearms like the early stages of Ayana's intricate tattoos. As he watched in fascination and, growing alarm, the lines seemed to pulse gently, as if they were alive. Marcus rolled up his sleeves and examined his arms directly, but he could see nothing on his actual skin. The markings were only visible in the reflection. He tried different pools, different angles, but the result was always the same. According to the water's surface, he was already beginning his transformation into whatever Ayana had become. The realization should have terrified him, but instead Marcus felt a strange sense of rightness, as if some part of him had been waiting his entire life for this moment. The markings in his reflection were beautiful, and they seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Without fully understanding why, he knew that they represented something important, something that connected him not just to this place but to a larger purpose he had never imagined. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself moving through the landscape with increasing confidence. His footsteps seemed to find the right path without conscious direction, and he began to notice details that had been invisible to him before. The calls of birds carried specific meanings about weather and water sources. The shapes of clouds indicated not just future rain but the emotional resonance of the storms that would bring it. Most remarkably, the very rocks beneath his feet seemed to hum with a frequency that he could feel in his bones. By the time the sun began to set, Marcus understood that his old life as a Phoenix paramedic was already fading like a half-remembered dream. Whatever was happening to him in this place between worlds, it was changing him at a fundamental level. The question was no longer whether he would return home unchanged, but whether he would choose to return home at all. As he made his way back to Ayana's camp, guided by instincts he was still learning to trust, Marcus realized that the column of smoke he had followed to find her had not been a campfire signal at all. It had been a beacon, calling him to exactly where he needed to be. The crash had not been a tragic accident that stranded him in the desert. It had been the first step in a journey that was just beginning. The transformation began in earnest during Marcus's second week in the place Ayana called the Threshold. He had stopped counting days in the conventional sense, partly because time seemed to flow differently here, but mostly because his old markers of progress no longer felt relevant. Instead, he measured his growth by the increasing clarity of the markings that appeared in his reflection and, by his growing ability to understand the subtle communications that flowed constantly through the desert around him. Ayana had become his teacher, but not in any way Marcus had expected. She rarely gave direct instruction, preferring instead to place him in situations where he would discover truths for himself. Each morning, she would set him a task that seemed simple on the surface but revealed layers of complexity as he attempted to complete it. On this particular morning, she handed him a smooth river stone about the size of his palm. The stone was unremarkable except for a single spiral carved into its surface, so faint it was barely visible. "Take this to the speaking rocks," Ayana said, pointing toward a distant formation that looked like a collection of balanced stones. "Listen to what they tell you about its history. Bring back not the stone itself, but what it has learned." Marcus had grown accustomed to Ayana's cryptic instructions, though he still felt frustrated by their apparent impossibility. "Rocks don't speak," he said, though with less conviction than he would have shown 2 weeks earlier. "Everything speaks," Ayana replied. "You simply have not learned their language yet." The journey to the speaking rocks took most of the morning, not because of distance but because Marcus had learned to move at the pace the land required. Rushing in this place led to confusion and wasted energy. Moving with patience and attention led to discoveries he never would have made otherwise. As he walked, Marcus noticed that the stone in his hand seemed to grow warmer, not from his body heat but from some internal source. By the time he reached the formation, the spiral carved into its surface had become clearly visible, glowing with a faint silver light. The speaking rocks were unlike anything in the normal world. 7 massive stones, each the size of a house, balanced impossibly on top of one another in a configuration that should have collapsed under its own weight. As Marcus approached, he could indeed hear something that might have been voices, though they spoke in frequencies just below the range of normal hearing. He sat in the center of the formation, as Ayana had taught him to do when seeking understanding from the land. Closing his eyes, he held the stone and tried to quiet his mind enough to perceive whatever message it might contain. At first, there was nothing but the usual desert sounds: whine through stone, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. But, gradually, Marcus became aware of something deeper, a resonance that seemed to come from the stone itself. Images began to form in his mind, not as thoughts but as direct experiences. He saw the stone as it had been millions of years ago, part of a vast mountain range that stretched to horizons he couldn't imagine. He felt the slow pressure of geological forces, the patient erosion of wind and water, the gradual journey from mountain peak to riverbed to desert floor. But, there was more than just geological history in the stone's memory. Marcus experienced flashes of the lives it had witnessed, ancient peoples who had used it in ceremonies, children who had skipped it across long-vanished lakes, warriors who had carried it for protection, healers who had ground pieces of it into medicine. Each image came with its own emotional resonance, creating a tapestry of human experience that spanned thousands of years. Marcus realized he was not just learning the stone's history, but the history of everyone who had ever touched it with significant intent. The spiral carved into its surface was not decoration but a map of all these connections, a record of the bonds between the stone and the countless lives it had touched. The most recent and powerful image showed him Ayana herself as a young woman, carving the spiral into the stone's surface with a tool made of obsidian and bone. But this was not the Ayana he knew. This woman was surrounded by others of her people, part of a community that celebrated her achievement in gaining the stone's trust and cooperation. As the vision faded, Marcus understood what Ayana had meant about bringing back what the stone had learned. The knowledge he had gained was not information about the stone, but wisdom the stone had accumulated through its long existence. It had learned that every connection matters, that nothing in the world exists in isolation, and that the bonds between conscious beings and the natural world are as real and important as any physical force. When Marcus opened his eyes, he found that the markings on his arms had become visible in normal light. The faint lines he had only seen in reflections were now clearly present on his skin, though they appeared as natural as if they had always been there. More surprisingly, he could feel them, not as foreign additions to his body, but as extensions of his nervous system that connected him to the broader network of life in the desert. The journey back to camp passed in a state of heightened awareness that Marcus had never experienced before. He could sense the mood of every plant and animal within 100 yards. He knew without looking where water could be found, which direction would lead to shelter, and how the weather would change over the coming days. Most remarkably, he could feel Ayana's presence like a warm beacon, drawing him home across miles of seemingly identical terrain. When he arrived at the camp, Ayana was waiting with a knowing smile. "You heard them," she said without preamble. "Yes," Marcus replied, though the words seemed inadequate to describe what had happened. But it was more than hearing. It was like remembering something I had forgotten I knew. "That is exactly what it was," Ayana said. "Your people have forgotten how to listen to the voices that surround you every day. You have developed remarkable tools for manipulating the physical world, but you have lost touch with its spiritual dimensions. Here in the threshold, those connections are still strong." Marcus looked down at his arms, where the markings were now clearly visible as thin silver lines that seemed to pulse with their own light. "What's happening to me? What are these markings really?" Ayana gestured for him to sit beside the fire, where she was preparing food that looked like nothing he had ever seen but smelled incredibly appetizing. "They are forming the foundation of your true education. Everything you have learned so far has been preparation for what comes next." "Which is what?" "You must choose what kind of guardian you wish to become," Ayana said simply. "There are many paths available to those who prove themselves capable of surviving in the threshold. Some become protectors of specific places or creatures. Others become guides for lost travelers. A few become bridges between worlds, carrying messages and knowledge back and forth between the realms." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. You're talking like I've already decided to stay here permanently. Haven't you? Ayana asked gently. When you held the stone today, did you feel any desire to return to your old life? When you experienced the deep connections between all living things, did you want to go back to a world that treats such connections as fantasy? Marcus opened his mouth to insist that of course he wanted to go home, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was that his old life as a Phoenix paramedic now seemed incredibly small and limited. How could he go back to treating isolated symptoms when he now understood the vast web of connections that linked every person to every other living thing? How could he return to seeing people as separate individuals when he now knew they were all part of a single, magnificent organism? There's still so much I don't understand, Marcus said finally. There always will be, Ayana replied. Understanding is not a destination but a journey. The question is whether you wish to continue that journey here or return to a place where such understanding is neither valued nor possible. Over the following days, Ayana began teaching Marcus more advanced techniques for reading the spiritual dimensions of the desert. She showed him how to track not just the physical movement of animals, but their emotional states and intentions. She taught him to distinguish between different types of weather based on the way plants responded to approaching changes. Most importantly, she helped him learn to communicate with the network of consciousness that connected every living thing in the threshold. The process was unlike anything from Marcus's previous education. Instead of memorizing facts or practicing skills, he was learning to expand his awareness in ways that felt both completely natural and utterly impossible. Each new ability seemed to unlock others, creating a cascade of expanding perception that changed his understanding of reality itself. During this time, the markings on his arms continued to evolve. New lines appeared daily, creating increasingly complex patterns that Marcus could feel were connected to his growing abilities. When he learned to sense water sources from great distances, lines appeared that looked like stylized rivers. When he mastered the ability to calm frightened animals, markings resembling feathers or fur appeared near his shoulders. Ayana explained that the markings were not decorations but functional elements of his transformation. They served as both a record of his achievements and a storage system for the knowledge and abilities he was gaining. In emergency situations, she told him, he would be able to access this stored information instantly, drawing on capabilities that would otherwise require conscious effort to activate. It is like having a library written on your skin, she said as they sat by the evening fire, examining the newest additions to his collection of markings. But, more than that, it is having that library connected directly to your nervous system, so that knowledge becomes as automatic as breathing. Marcus traced some of the more complex patterns on his forearms, marveling at the way they seemed to shift and flow under his touch. How long does it take to complete the process? That depends on the individual and the path they choose, Ayana replied. Some guardians develop their markings over decades. Others complete their initial transformation in weeks or months. There is no standard timeline, only the rhythm that feels right for each person's growth. How long did it take for you? Ayana's expression became distant, and Marcus realized he had asked about something painful. I have been here for longer than you might expect, she said eventually. Time moves differently in the threshold, and I have experienced both its gifts and its costs. Before Marcus could ask what she meant, Ayana stood and walked to the edge of the camp. Tomorrow, you will face your first real test, she said without turning around. Tonight, you should rest and prepare yourself mentally for what is to come. Marcus wanted to press for more information, but he had learned to trust Ayana's sense of timing. Instead, he spent the evening practicing the meditation techniques she had taught him, focusing on the growing sense of connection he felt to the land around him. As he settled into sleep, Marcus found himself thinking about the world he had left behind. His supervisor at the ambulance service had probably declared him dead by now. His apartment would be cleaned out, his belongings distributed or discarded. His few friends would have grieved and moved on with their lives. In every practical sense, Marcus Sullivan the paramedic had already ceased to exist. The realization should have been devastating, but instead Marcus felt a profound sense of relief. He had been dying slowly in his old life, worn down by the constant exposure to human suffering and his inability to address its deeper causes. Here in the threshold, he was becoming something larger and more capable than he had ever imagined possible. His dreams that night were filled with visions of the test that awaited him. He saw himself standing at the edge of a vast canyon, with Ayana on one side and a figure he couldn't quite make out on the other. Between them stretched a bridge made not of stone or wood, but of light itself. To cross it, he would have to trust not just in his growing abilities, but in the fundamental rightness of the choice he was making. When Marcus woke the next morning, the camp had changed. The familiar wickiups were still there, but now the area was surrounded by standing stones that hadn't been there the night before. Each stone was carved with symbols similar to those that marked his arms, creating a circle of power that he could feel humming in the air around him. Ayana stood at the center of the circle, wearing traditional Apache clothing that was far more elaborate than anything Marcus had seen her wear before. Her own markings seemed to glow more brightly than usual, and her hair was adorned with feathers and beads that created a subtle musical sound when she moved. "Today you choose," she said as Marcus approached. "Not with words, but with action. You will be tested on everything you have learned, and the results of that test will determine whether you are ready to accept the full responsibility of becoming a guardian." Marcus felt nervous but not afraid. The weeks of training had prepared him for this moment, and he trusted both in his own growth and in Ayana's guidance. "What do I need to do?" Ayana smiled and gestured toward the northern edge of the circle, where a path Marcus had never seen before led away into the desert. "Follow the path until you reach the choice stone. There you will find what you seek, but only if you are truly ready to find it." As Marcus began walking toward the path, Ayana called after him. "Remember, Marcus Sullivan, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear. Whatever you encounter on this journey, trust in what you have learned and in the connections you have forged." The path led away from the familiar territory around Ayana's camp and into a landscape that seemed to shift and change as Marcus walked through it. The desert terrain remained constant, but the emotional atmosphere of the place fluctuated wildly. Sometimes he felt welcomed and supported by the land around him. Other times he felt challenged or even threatened by forces he couldn't see but could definitely sense. As the sun reached its zenith, Marcus came to a place where the path split into three directions. There were no signs or markers to indicate which route he should take, but as he stood considering his options, he realized that each path carried a different emotional resonance. The left path felt familiar and safe, leading back toward territory that seemed similar to where he had spent the past weeks. The right path felt exciting but dangerous, leading toward unknown challenges that might be beyond his current abilities. The center path felt balanced but uncertain, offering neither the comfort of the familiar nor the thrill of the completely unknown. Marcus understood that this was part of his test. Choosing the safe path might mean he wasn't ready for greater responsibilities. Choosing the dangerous path might mean he was overconfident about his abilities. But choosing the middle path might mean he was being appropriately cautious, or it might mean he was avoiding commitment to either safety or adventure. After several minutes of consideration, Marcus realized that he was overthinking the decision. Ayana had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts were clearly pointing him toward the right path, despite its potential dangers. He had not come this far by playing it safe, and the test was likely designed to see whether he would continue to take appropriate risks in service of his growth. As he began walking down the right path, Marcus felt his markings beginning to pulse more rapidly, as if responding to some external stimulus. The landscape around him became increasingly surreal, with rock formations that seemed to defy gravity and plants that grew in impossible configurations. Most disconcerting of all, he began to encounter animals that he was sure didn't exist in the normal world, creatures that combined features from multiple species in ways that should have been evolutionary impossibilities. Despite their bizarre appearance, none of these creatures seemed threatening. Instead, they watched him with what appeared to be curiosity and approval, as if his presence on this path was both expected and welcomed. A few of them even approached him closely enough that he could sense their emotional states, and what he felt was a kind of joyful recognition, as if they knew who he was becoming even better than he did himself. The path eventually led to a natural amphitheater carved into the red rock, at the center of which stood a single black stone about twice the height of a man. The stone was covered with markings similar to those that now decorated Marcus's arms, but far more complex and extensive. As he approached, Marcus could feel power radiating from the stone like heat from a fire. This had to be the choice stone that Ayanna had mentioned, but Marcus wasn't sure what choice he was supposed to make. He circled the stone slowly, examining the markings and trying to understand what they might mean. Some of the symbols seemed familiar from his time with Ayanna, but others were completely foreign, suggesting knowledge and traditions that went far beyond anything she had taught him. As Marcus completed his circle around the stone, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. Among the complex array of markings was a blank space, roughly the size and shape of a human handprint. The implications were clear: he was supposed to place his hand on the stone, but doing so would clearly be an irreversible action that would bind him permanently to whatever fate awaited guardians of the threshold. Marcus stood before the choice stone for what felt like hours, though the sun's position in the sky didn't seem to change. He thought about his old life in Phoenix, about the friends and colleagues who believed him dead, about the career he had trained for and the purpose he had thought he was meant to fulfill. Then, he thought about everything he had learned and experienced since arriving in this place, about the connections he had discovered and the abilities he was developing. The choice, when it finally came, felt as natural as breathing. Marcus pressed his palm against the blank space on the choice stone, and immediately felt a surge of energy that seemed to rewrite every cell in his body. The markings on his arms blazed with silver light, and new patterns appeared on his chest and back with such speed that he could feel them being burned into his skin. But there was no pain, only a sense of completion and rightness that filled him with a joy so profound it brought tears to his eyes. Marcus understood now that he had not lost his old life but had discovered his true one. He was not becoming something other than himself but was finally becoming who he had always been meant to be. When the light faded and the energy surge subsided, Marcus found that he was no longer alone in the amphitheater. Ayanna stood beside him, but now he could see her clearly for what she truly was, not just a guardian of the threshold, but a being of such power and wisdom that his previous understanding of her had been like seeing a mountain and mistaking it for a hill. "Welcome, brother," she said, and Marcus realized that her voice now carried harmonics he had never heard before, frequencies that spoke directly to his transformed consciousness. "You have chosen well. Now your real work begins." Marcus's first assignment as a newly transformed guardian came sooner than he expected. 3 days after his experience at the choice stone, Ayanna woke him before dawn with an urgency he had never seen in her before. "There is a disturbance in the Eastern Territory," she said, already gathering supplies that seemed to materialize from thin air. "Someone has crossed into the threshold without invitation, and they are causing damage that could tear the barrier between worlds." Marcus sat up quickly, immediately alert despite having been deep in sleep moments before. His transformation had heightened all his senses, including his ability to detect threats to the delicate balance that kept the threshold stable. Even from their camp, he could now feel a wrongness in the direction Ayanna indicated, like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious symphony. "What kind of damage?" Marcus asked as he prepared to leave. His own supplies seemed to organize themselves around him, responding to his intent rather than requiring conscious packing. "The kind that comes from fear and desperation," Ayanna replied grimly. "Someone is trying to force their way back to the ordinary world using methods that could destroy both the threshold and themselves. We must stop them before they succeed in failing." As they traveled eastward, moving at a pace that covered ground far faster than should have been physically possible, Ayanna explained more about the delicate nature of the barriers between worlds. The threshold existed in a state of careful equilibrium, balance between the ordinary reality Marcus had known and the deeper spiritual dimensions that most humans could no longer perceive. When people arrive here through natural means, crisis, spiritual calling, or genuine accident, the barriers adjust to accommodate them, she said as they navigated through terrain that seemed to reshape itself to ease their passage. But, when someone tries to force their way through using purely physical or technological methods, they create tears that can spread like cracks in glass. What happens if the barriers fail completely? Marcus asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. Chaos, Ayana said simply. The ordinary world is not prepared for uncontrolled contact with the spiritual dimensions. And, the spiritual realms are not meant to be invaded by those who approach them with violence and exploitation in their hearts. Both worlds would be damaged, perhaps permanently. As they drew closer to the disturbance, Marcus began to make out details that filled him with growing alarm. Someone had established a camp in a valley that should have been inaccessible to anyone without guardian training. Worse, they had brought modern equipment, generators, computers, communication devices, and were using them to create some kind of systematic assault on the boundary itself. How is this possible? Marcus asked. I thought the threshold protected itself from this kind of intrusion. It does, under normal circumstances, Ayana replied, her expression darkening. But, this person has knowledge they should not possess. They are using information that was meant to remain secret, techniques that were developed by my people generations ago and, then, deliberately hidden when we realized their potential for abuse. As they crested a ridge overlooking the valley, Marcus got his first clear look at the intruder and felt his heart sink. The man working frantically at a complex array of electronic equipment was Dr. James Morrison, a research scientist Marcus recognized from news stories about controversial experiments in consciousness research. Morrison had been investigating claims of parallel dimensions and alternate realities, but his work had been shut down by academic institutions after ethical concerns were raised about his methods. I know him, Marcus said. He's a scientist who was discredited for conducting dangerous experiments on human subjects. But, how did he find this place? How did he get here? The same way you did, initially, Ayana said. Through a genuine crisis that opened the way. But, unlike you, he has refused to accept what the threshold offers. Instead, he seeks to conquer and control it. Morrison's camp was a jarring intrusion of the modern world into the timeless landscape of the threshold. Banks of computers analyzed readings from sensors placed throughout the valley. Generators powered equipment that Marcus didn't recognize but which hummed with an energy that made his new markings burn painfully. Most disturbing of all, Morrison had somehow captured several of the spirit animals that inhabited the threshold and was holding them in containment fields while he conducted experiments. He's torturing them, Marcus said, feeling rage build in his chest as he watched one of the captured creatures, something like a coyote but with an iridescent coat that shifted through all the colors of sunset, struggling futilely against bonds of pure energy. Yes, Ayana said, her voice carrying a sadness that spoke of having witnessed such cruelty before. He believes that by studying their spiritual essence, he can learn to harness the power of the threshold for his own purposes. He does not understand that such power cannot be stolen, only earned through genuine transformation. What's our plan? Marcus asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Morrison had to be stopped, but the methods available to guardians were unlike anything from his old life as a paramedic. We offer him the same choice that was offered to you, Ayana said. Transformation or departure. If he chooses transformation, he must first undo the damage he has caused and submit to proper training. If he chooses departure, he must leave immediately and have his memory of this place sealed so he cannot return or guide others here. And, if he chooses neither? Ayana's expression became grimmer than Marcus had ever seen it. Then, we must ensure that he can never leave the threshold, and that knowledge of his methods dies with him. The safety of both worlds must take priority over the life of any individual, even one who arrived here through legitimate crisis. They approached Morrison's camp openly, making no attempt at stealth. As guardians of the threshold, they had both the right and the responsibility to confront anyone who threatened its stability. Morrison looked up from his equipment as they approached, and Marcus saw immediately that the man was in worse condition than he had initially appeared. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face gaunt from poor nutrition and lack of sleep. Most tellingly, his eyes held the wild look of someone who had been pushed far beyond his psychological limits. "Stay back!" Morrison shouted, raising a device that looked like a cross between a cattle prod and a lightning rod. "I don't know what kind of hallucinations you are, but I won't be stopped when I'm this close to a breakthrough." "Dr. Morrison," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm and professional despite the anger he felt about the captured animals. "My name is Marcus Sullivan. I'm here to help you, but first you need to stop what you're doing. Your experiments are causing damage that could hurt both you and countless others." Morrison laughed, a sound that contained no humor at all. "Marcus Sullivan? You're supposed to be dead. Died in a helicopter crash over a month ago. Nice try, hallucination, but I've done my research on everyone who's ever disappeared in this region." Marcus felt a chill as he realized the implications of Morrison's words. If the scientist had researched disappearances in the area, he had probably discovered patterns that revealed the existence of the threshold. Worse, he had apparently been planning this intrusion for some time, which meant his arrival here was not the desperate accident Marcus had assumed. "How long have you known about this place?" Ayanna asked, stepping forward with the kind of presence that made even Morrison's wild energy falter slightly. "Long enough to prepare properly," Morrison replied, though his voice shook as he spoke. "Long enough to develop technology that can function here despite the electromagnetic anomalies. Long enough to create containment systems that can hold your so-called spirit animals while I study their energy patterns." "And, what do you hope to achieve with this study?" Ayanna continued, her voice taking on harmonics that Marcus recognized as a form of psychological pressure designed to encourage honesty. Morrison's expression shifted, revealing depths of ambition and desperation that explained much about his presence here. "I'm going to prove that consciousness is not limited to biological systems," he said. "I'm going to demonstrate that spiritual experiences have measurable, reproducible physical components. And I'm going to use that knowledge to develop technologies that can enhance human consciousness beyond anything evolution has provided. At the cost of torturing innocent beings," Marcus said, gesturing toward the captured animals. "At the cost of whatever is necessary." Morrison snapped. "Do you have any idea what this could mean for humanity? We could eliminate mental illness, enhance intelligence, create forms of consciousness that transcend the limitations of individual brains. The potential benefits justify any temporary suffering." Marcus felt his markings beginning to burn more intensely as Morrison spoke, and he realized that the man's presence and activities were not just causing environmental damage to the threshold, but were actively poisoning the spiritual atmosphere of the place. The captured animals were not just suffering physical confinement but were being drained of their essential life force to power Morrison's experiments. "You're killing them," Marcus said, his voice carrying new harmonics of authority that he didn't consciously control. "And you're killing the threshold itself with your approach to knowledge." "Everything dies eventually," Morrison replied. "The question is whether their deaths serve a greater purpose or are simply meaningless. I'm giving their suffering meaning by using it to advance human understanding." Ayanna stepped forward, and Marcus felt power radiating from her in waves that made the air itself seem to thicken. "Dr. James Morrison," she said formally, "you have violated the sacred boundaries of the threshold and caused suffering to beings under our protection. You are offered the choice that all who come here must make: transformation, departure, or containment. Choose now." Morrison raised his makeshift weapon higher, and Marcus could see energy building up in its tip. "I choose conquest," he said. "I choose to take what I need and leave when I'm finished. And, if you're real rather than hallucinations, I choose to study you as well." The attack came without warning. Morrison triggered his device, and a bolt of searing energy struck Ayanna directly in the chest. But, instead of causing injury, the energy seemed to be absorbed by her markings, which flared brighter as they converted the attack into something harmless. "Your technology cannot harm us here," Ayana said calmly. "But, your presence continues to damage the threshold. You have chosen neither transformation nor departure, so containment must be implemented." What happened next taught Marcus more about the true power of Guardians than all his previous training combined. Ayana didn't move toward Morrison or make any obvious gesture, but, suddenly, the ground beneath the scientist's feet became fluid, flowing like water while remaining solid enough to support him. His equipment began to malfunction as the electromagnetic fields that powered it were disrupted by energies Marcus could feel but not see. Most remarkably, the captured animals simply walked through their containment fields as if the barriers no longer existed. They gathered around Ayana, and Marcus could sense them communicating with her in ways that transcended ordinary language. "You're using some kind of advanced technology disguised as mysticism," Morrison said, though his voice now carried more fear than conviction. "Electromagnetic manipulation, localized gravity distortion, maybe even quantum field effects. But, I can figure it out. I can reverse engineer whatever you're doing." "Dr. Morrison," Marcus said, feeling compelled to make one final attempt at reaching the man's humanity. "You came here because your old life had reached a crisis point. The same thing happened to me. The threshold offers genuine transformation, genuine answers to the questions that drove you here. But, you have to be willing to let go of your assumptions about how knowledge should be acquired." For a moment, Morrison's expression softened, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the genuine scientific curiosity that had originally motivated him. But, then, the moment passed, and the desperate hunger for control reasserted itself. "I won't let go of anything," Morrison said. "I've sacrificed too much to get this far. I've lost my career, my reputation, my family. This place is going to give me back everything I've lost and, more, whether it wants to or not." Ayana sighed, a sound that carried centuries of sadness for human beings who chose destruction over transformation. "Then, you have made your final choice," she said. The containment began immediately. The ground beneath Morrison's feet continued to soften until he sank into it up to his ankles, then, his knees. His equipment dissolved like sugar in water, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. Most unsettling of all, Morrison himself began to fade, becoming increasingly translucent as whatever force was containing him pulled him out of normal reality. "Wait!" Morrison screamed, panic finally, breaking through his scientific detachment. "I can change. I can choose transformation. Give me another chance." But, Ayana shook her head sadly. "Transformation requires genuine willingness to release old patterns. You have demonstrated that you will only pretend to change while waiting for an opportunity to return to your previous behaviors. The threshold cannot risk that level of contamination." "What's happening to him?" Marcus asked, watching Morrison fade until he was barely visible. "He is being placed in a state of suspended existence," Ayana explained. "He will experience no passage of time, no suffering, but also no ability to affect either this world or any other. He will remain in this state until he genuinely releases his need to control and exploit what he cannot understand." "And, how long might that take?" "For some, decades. For others, centuries. A very few never learn, and remain suspended forever." As Morrison's final traces disappeared, the valley began to heal itself with a speed that amazed Marcus. The scars left by the intrusion sealed themselves like wounds closing. The electromagnetic distortions that had been poisoning the spiritual atmosphere dissipated like smoke. Most remarkably, the spots where Morrison's equipment had stood began to bloom with plants that looked like nothing from the ordinary world, as if the threshold was asserting its essential nature more strongly than ever before. The rescued animals approached Marcus and Ayana with what could only be described as gratitude. As they touched his hands with their noses or paws, Marcus felt communication flowing between them that conveyed complex concepts more efficiently than any human language could manage. They were telling him about Morrison's experiments, about the pain and confusion they had endured, but also about their understanding that not all humans were like their captor. "Will they be all right?" Marcus asked, noting that several of the animals still seemed weakened by their ordeal. "They will recover," Ayana assured him. "The spiritual essence that was stolen from them will regenerate in time. But, this incident has shown us that our security measures need to be strengthened." Morrison was not the first to acquire forbidden knowledge about the threshold, and he will not be the last. How did he learn about this place? How did he know techniques that should have remained secret? Ayana's expression grew troubled. "That is what we must discover. There are guardians who have left the threshold over the centuries, and a few have violated their oaths by sharing what they learned here. If someone is actively teaching these techniques to people like Morrison, we have a much larger problem than one misguided scientist." As they began the journey back to their camp, Marcus found himself thinking about the choice Morrison had been offered and rejected. The man had been genuinely desperate when he arrived at the threshold, driven by personal and professional failures that had destroyed his life in the ordinary world. Under different circumstances, he might have become a guardian himself, using his scientific background to help bridge the gap between spiritual reality and physical understanding. Could he have been saved? Marcus asked as they traveled. If we had approached him differently, or if he had arrived here under different conditions. Perhaps, Ayana replied. But, transformation cannot be forced on anyone, and it cannot occur while someone clings to patterns of exploitation and control. Morrison's scientific training could have been an asset, but he used it as a weapon against the very thing he sought to understand. How do we prevent this from happening again? By being more vigilant about detecting unauthorized intrusions, and by tracking down whoever is teaching forbidden knowledge to the unworthy. Your first major assignment as a guardian will be to investigate these breaches and stop them at their source. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. When he had chosen transformation at the choice stone, he had thought primarily about his own growth and development. Now he was beginning to understand that becoming a guardian meant accepting responsibility not just for his own spiritual evolution, but for protecting the delicate balance that allowed both the threshold and the ordinary world to exist safely. "I'm ready," he said, and was surprised to discover that he meant it completely. "I know you are," Ayana replied. "But, readiness is only the beginning. What comes next will test everything you have learned and everything you are becoming. The people who are teaching forbidden knowledge have had decades or even centuries to develop their methods. They will not be stopped easily." As their camp came into view, Marcus noticed something that hadn't been there when they left. A new wickiup had been constructed, larger and more elaborate than the others, with markings carved into its supporting poles that matched some of the patterns on his own arms. "Is that for me?" he asked. "It is yours by right," Ayana confirmed. "You are no longer my student but my partner in protecting the threshold. The camp belongs to both of us equally now, though I suspect you will not be spending much time here in the immediate future." "Why not?" Ayana smiled, but her expression contained both pride and concern. "Because the investigation you must undertake will require you to travel to places where even experienced guardians rarely venture. You will need to enter territories controlled by rogue guardians who have spent lifetimes perfecting their defenses against detection and interference." Marcus felt his markings pulse with energy as Ayana spoke, as if they were already preparing him for challenges he couldn't yet imagine. "Will I be going alone?" "For most of the journey, yes. The places you must investigate are warded against multiple guardians working together. But, you will not be entirely without support." Ayana reached into one of her pouches and withdrew something that made Marcus's breath catch. It was a small stone carved with symbols similar to those on the choice stone, but these markings pulsed with active power that he could feel from several feet away. "This is a communication stone," she explained. "As long as you carry it, we will remain connected across any distance. If you find yourself in genuine danger, focus your energy through the stone and I will know immediately. More importantly, the stone will help you maintain your connection to the threshold even when you venture into corrupted territories where the natural flow of spiritual energy has been deliberately disrupted. Marcus accepted the stone, feeling its power integrate seamlessly with his own markings. The connection to Ayana strengthened until he could sense her presence as clearly as if she were standing next to him, even when he closed his eyes. "When do I leave?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Ayana replied. "Tonight, you rest and prepare yourself mentally for what lies ahead. From tomorrow forward, you will be truly on your own for the first time since your transformation began." As Marcus settled into his new dwelling for what might be his last peaceful night for some time, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since the helicopter crash that had brought him to the threshold. The man who had crawled away from that wreckage would never have imagined himself preparing to hunt down rogue guardians who threatened the stability of multiple realities. But, the person he had become felt equal to the challenge. His markings pulsed gently in the darkness, reminding him that he was no longer the limited being who had once thought paramedicine represented the height of his ability to help others. Now he was responsible for protecting not just individual lives but the fundamental structures that allowed life itself to flourish in its infinite variety. Tomorrow, his real work would begin. Marcus's journey to track down the source of the forbidden knowledge took him farther from the threshold than he had ever imagined possible. Following traces of spiritual corruption that were invisible to anyone without guardian training, he had traveled through landscapes that existed in the spaces between ordinary reality and the deeper dimensions of existence. For 3 months, he had pursued leads that seemed to evaporate just as he drew close to answers. The rogue guardians who were teaching dangerous techniques to people like Morrison had developed sophisticated methods of hiding their activities. They moved through territories that shifted location regularly, used communication methods that left no permanent traces, and recruited followers who were carefully selected for their desperation and their willingness to accept any explanation that gave them hope of gaining power over their circumstances. Now, as Marcus crouched on a ridge overlooking what appeared to be an abandoned mining town in territory that existed somewhere between Arizona and New Mexico but belonged fully to neither, he finally had a clear view of his target. The buildings below were physically real but overlaid with spiritual architecture that created a complex maze of hidden passages and protected spaces. Most importantly, he could sense the presence of at least a dozen people who had been partially transformed by exposure to guardian techniques but had never completed the process properly. These incomplete guardians were dangerous in ways that Morrison had never been. They possessed genuine power but lacked the wisdom and restraint that came with proper training. Worse, their incomplete transformation made them unstable, prone to using their abilities in ways that damaged both themselves and the spiritual environment around them. Marcus had been watching the settlement for 2 days, using skills Ayana had taught him to remain invisible to both ordinary senses and spiritual detection. During that time, he had identified the leadership structure of the rogue community and had begun to understand their ultimate goal. They were not simply teaching forbidden techniques for profit or personal satisfaction. They were attempting to create a parallel network of corrupted guardians who could challenge the authority of the legitimate threshold protectors. Their leader, a woman who appeared to be in her 50s but whose spiritual presence suggested she was far older, was working toward nothing less than the complete transformation of human consciousness through forced evolution rather than voluntary growth. The implications were staggering. If she succeeded in creating enough corrupted guardians, she could potentially destabilize all the barriers between dimensions, forcing a merger between the ordinary world and the spiritual realms that would transform every human being whether they chose it or not. Such a change would destroy the careful balance that allowed both forms of existence to flourish, creating chaos that might take centuries to resolve. Marcus activated his communication stone, feeling the familiar warmth as it connected him to Ayana across the vast distance between them. Through the stone, he could sense her immediate attention focusing on him. "I found them," he communicated, not with words but with direct transfer of his observations and conclusions. "It's worse than we thought. They're not just teaching forbidden techniques. They're building an army." Ayana's response came back laden with concern and determination. "How many corrupted guardians have they created?" At least 30 that I can detect, possibly more. But, that's not the most dangerous part. Their leader has access to knowledge that goes beyond anything I learned during my training. She's using techniques that feel ancient, like they come from the earliest days of Guardian development. That should be impossible, Ayana replied. Those techniques were sealed away for good reason. They were too dangerous to use safely, even by fully trained Guardians. She calls herself Yama Dreamstalker. Does that name mean anything to you? The silence that followed Marcus's question lasted so long that he began to worry that the communication stone had malfunctioned. When Ayana finally responded, her mental voice carried emotions he had never sensed from her before: fear, anger, and what might have been personal betrayal. Yama was my teacher, centuries ago. She was the one who trained me in the Guardian ways before I came to the threshold. I thought she had died long ago. Apparently not. And, apparently she's developed ideas about Guardian responsibilities that differ significantly from what you taught me. She was always ambitious, Ayana admitted. She believed that Guardians should take a more active role in human development rather than simply protecting the boundaries between worlds. We disagreed about that philosophy, which is why I chose to dedicate myself to the threshold rather than continuing to work with her. Marcus absorbed this information while continuing to observe the settlement below. Now that he knew who he was dealing with, many things made more sense. Yama Dreamstalker had the knowledge and experience to train corrupted Guardians effectively, and she had apparently spent centuries developing her alternative philosophy and building the resources to implement it. What do you want me to do? Marcus asked. I could probably infiltrate the settlement by pretending to be a potential recruit, but, if she trained you, she'll certainly be able to recognize that I learned my techniques from you. No, Ayana replied firmly. Do not attempt infiltration. Yama has ways of detecting deception that go far beyond anything I taught you. Instead, focus on gathering more information about her plans and her timeline. If she's preparing for some kind of large-scale action, we need to know when and where it will occur. Marcus settled in for what he knew would be a long period of careful observation. Using techniques that allowed him to extend his consciousness beyond his physical body, he began to explore the spiritual architecture of the settlement below. The process was exhausting and dangerous, requiring him to maintain awareness of his hidden position while simultaneously sending part of his consciousness on reconnaissance missions that could reveal his presence if detected. What he discovered over the following hours was even more alarming than he had expected. Yama Dreamstalker was not simply training corrupted Guardians for some eventual assault on the legitimate Guardian network. She was preparing them for an operation that would take place within days, and the target was not the threshold itself but the ordinary world beyond its borders. Her plan was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. She intended to use her corrupted Guardians to force open permanent portals between dimensions in major population centers across the globe. The resulting influx of spiritual energy would trigger involuntary transformation in millions of people simultaneously, creating a cascade effect that would ultimately transform all human consciousness whether individuals chose it or not. She's going to attack cities, Marcus reported to Ayana. Phoenix, Los Angeles, Denver, Albuquerque, anywhere with large populations near natural dimensional weak points. She believes that if she can transform enough people at once, the change will become irreversible and spread to the entire human population. When? Ayana's response came back immediately. 3 days from now. She's calling it the Great Awakening. Her followers believe they're saving humanity from its own limitations, but they don't seem to understand that forced transformation destroys the very thing they claim to be enhancing. They understand, Ayana replied grimly. They simply don't care. Yama always believed that the ends justified any means, no matter how destructive. She would sacrifice the individuality and free will of every human being if she thought it would result in a more spiritually evolved species. Marcus felt his markings beginning to burn as the full implications of what he had discovered settled into his consciousness. He was not just dealing with rogue Guardians who had made poor choices, but with a carefully planned assault on the fundamental structure of reality itself. If Yama succeeded, the world he had grown up in would cease to exist, replaced by something that might be more powerful but would certainly be less human. "What can we do to stop her?" he asked. "We need help," Ayana admitted. "This is beyond what either of us can handle alone. I'm going to contact the other Threshold Guardians and call for an emergency gathering. But that will take time, and you said she's planning to act in 3 days. I could sabotage her operation somehow," Marcus suggested. "If I can't infiltrate the settlement directly, maybe I can find a way to disrupt her preparations from the outside." "Too dangerous, and probably ineffective. Yama has had centuries to perfect her defenses. Any direct assault would likely fail and would certainly reveal your presence to her." Marcus was about to respond when he noticed something that changed everything. A familiar figure was approaching the settlement from the opposite direction, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged there. As the figure came closer, Marcus felt his breath catch in recognition. Dr. James Morrison was walking toward Yama Dreamstalker's stronghold, apparently free from the containment that should have held him suspended until he learned to release his need for control and exploitation. "Ayana," Marcus said urgently, "we have a bigger problem. Morrison is here. Somehow he's escaped containment and found his way to Yama's operation." The silence that followed was even longer than before, and, when Ayana finally responded, her mental voice carried a depth of concern that made Marcus's markings pulse with sympathetic alarm. "That should be absolutely impossible," she said. "Containment created by the threshold itself cannot be broken except by the person contained achieving genuine transformation. If Morrison is free, it means either he has genuinely changed his fundamental nature, or something has interfered with the threshold's power. Which is more likely? Given that he's approaching Yama's stronghold rather than seeking to make amends for his previous actions, I would say interference is far more probable. And that means Yama has developed capabilities that go beyond anything I thought possible." Marcus watched as Morrison was welcomed into the settlement with what appeared to be genuine celebration. Several of the corrupted guardians gathered around him, and Marcus could see energy flowing between them in patterns that suggested some kind of knowledge exchange. Morrison was sharing information about his experiences in the threshold, and, in return, was receiving training in the techniques he had been seeking all along. He's teaching them about his technology, Marcus realized. She's combining his scientific knowledge with guardian techniques to create something entirely new. That explains how she plans to force open permanent portals, Ayana said, her mental voice tight with understanding. Pure guardian techniques can open temporary passages between dimensions, but keeping them stable requires continuous effort. If she's developed technological assistance for the spiritual components, she could create self-sustaining breaches that would remain open indefinitely. Marcus felt the weight of the situation settling on him like a physical burden. Not only was Yama Dreamstalker planning to transform humanity against its will, but she now had the technological knowledge to make her plan far more effective than anyone had imagined. The combination of corrupted guardian techniques and Morrison's scientific expertise created possibilities that were terrifying to contemplate. "I have to go down there," Marcus said, surprising himself with the certainty in his mental voice. "Whatever the risks, I have to find a way to stop this before she has time to implement her plan." "No," Ayana replied immediately. "You would be walking into a trap. Yama knows about our connection through the communication stone. She's probably been aware of your presence since you arrived in the area. Then, why hasn't she done anything about it? Because she wants you to come to her. She's hoping to capture and corrupt you the same way she corrupted the others. A guardian trained in proper threshold techniques would be a valuable addition to her collection." Marcus felt his markings beginning to shift and change as his emotions intensified. The patterns on his arms were responding to his growing determination, creating new configurations that he didn't recognize but that felt connected to powers he had never accessed before. "Then, I'll give her what she wants," he said. "But, not the way she expects." "Marcus, no. Whatever you're planning, it's too dangerous." "Maybe. But, doing nothing is certainly too dangerous. If she succeeds with her great awakening, everything we've worked to protect will be destroyed anyway. Marcus began moving down the ridge toward the settlement before Ayanna could argue further. As he walked, he could feel his markings continuing to evolve, responding to his conscious decision to risk everything in defense of the principles he had learned to value. The patterns were becoming more complex and powerful, but they were also becoming more unstable, burning with an energy that he knew he couldn't maintain indefinitely. "I won't let go," he said, speaking the words aloud for the first time since they had become his personal motto during the helicopter crash that had brought him to this moment. "I won't let go of what I've learned, what I've become, or what I'm fighting to protect." The communication stone pulsed with Ayanna's desperate attempts to contact him, but Marcus carefully set it aside. Where he was going, he couldn't afford to have his connection to the threshold detected and used against him. He